I'm delighted to be here, and delighted, first of all, that having had many connections and knowledge of the having had many connections for many years and friendships and acquaintance with many great scholars of Irish literature and of literature. This is in fact my first time coming to Brazil, so thank you so much to Laura and to everyone really who made this possible. And I've been to Argentina a number of times and to Peru, and I've got to know many great scholars, writers, who all of you connected with and really enriched Irish studies. And for me it's a great honour to be here, and a great pleasure as well. But I've always, as somebody who's worked all his life in Irish writing, I've always been so impressed and so enriched by the scholarship of, say, for example, we have many dear friends in Spain, in Argentina, and of course here in Brazil, who've been working on Irish literature. And it's, for a small country, it feels amazing to have this diaspora of scholarship. And we learn so much about our country. I've learned so much about my country and the literature of my country from the researches and perspectives of the scholars from all over the world. So I just wanted to say that, and to say how glad I am to be here, and to talk today a little bit about, I suppose, looking particularly at one aspect of my work, which has been my research, particularly on, I suppose, the ways in which, I'm going to talk a bit about this tomorrow, but I want to give us a short quote. I'll talk a little more tomorrow about my own work and what has influenced me. But in my scholarly research, I suppose watching Ireland change radically in my lifetime for all sorts of reasons. One of the things that interests me is the hidden stories, the hidden literary stories of the past. And I'm very influenced by something Adrienne Rich wrote in 1980, talking about from her work on secrets, lies, secrets, and silence. And she says, whatever is unnamed, undepicted in images, whatever is omitted from biography, censored in collections of letters, whatever is misnamed as something else, made difficult to come by, will become not merely unspoken, but unspeakable. And I think in many ways, I had watched Irish studies and the kind of work that we've all been engaged in change to reflect the profound and radical alterations in Irish society, and therefore in Irish literature, over the past 30, 40 years. It's a time of radical change. What did Joyce call literature? The cracked, Irish literature indeed, the cracked looking glass of a servant. He was angry that Ireland was, as he saw it, a servant to Rome or to Caesar, be it the Catholic Church or the British Empire. And he saw literature as a mirror in which you see versions of yourself, but that Irish literature was cracked, it was distorted. What interests me is those distortions and where they're based on silence and lost stories. And I put this more bluntly, I suppose. When I began my career, I began researching in UCD in the 1980s. And I then began working in publishing from the 90s onwards. Some of the work I've done would not have given me the opportunity to pursue an academic career. In other words, and I think many of us have worked in these areas, what you can write about has changed radically now. The kind of stories you can engage with and the ways in which you can look at the past. So this is one of the things. So I'm very interested in, for example, the Wilde family. And this is a book I published last year before, the biography of Jane Wilde, Speranza, mother of Oscar Wilde, the wife of William Wilde. And something very significant about Jane Wilde is the fact that in the house that she lived in for the longest period of her life, number 1 Merrion Square, for many years there's been a plaque to her husband, William, deservedly, a very interesting and very learned scientist and medical and historian and archaeologist. It was quite lately quite belatedly, a plaque to her disgraced son, Oscar. But when was the plaque to Jane Wilde put up? Any guesses? November 2021. The 200th anniversary of her birth. Not that she ever admitted to that date, but anyway. And it took us a great campaign to make that happen. And it happened in a lockdown, everyone was outside, but it's finally there. So when you're in Dublin next, or when you're in Dublin anytime, go to Merrion Square and see that the plaque to Jane Wilde, which both William and Oscar would have been the first to insist upon being there, is now finally there. So I want to talk a little bit about the legacy of the Wilde family, some of the research I did, and particularly the influence of Oscar Wilde, his fate, his kind of him as an exemplar for the man that we also celebrate, James Joyce. So here we have a selection of images of the Wilde, a very nice picture of William Wilde, very distinct, two awful sort of cartoons of Jane Wilde, one of them a sort of cartoon and the other one making her look like some version of Mother Ireland. Something she would have agreed with to some degree. She was an impassioned revolutionary and also a poet of great distinction. Some of the poetry, as a fantastic scholar, Eleanor Fitzsimon and myself, are bringing out an edition of Jane Wilde's poems. They've been out of print. I traced them for translations. She translated widely from the Portuguese. So we've traced and found those, and they'll be available. We'll bring them out next year, and I'm available to come back and talk about them in Mexico, perhaps. Because I know it would be so interesting to open up Jane Wilde's work even more to Brazilian scholars and to look at her influences. And I feel even the availability of such poetry is going to, I think, increase the sense and interest in her in terms of the kind of study we've all been doing. So there are all the pictures. William says Oscar. And this is the book that I was talking about and I'm going to draw upon today. That's a much nicer picture of Esperanza, which I've used on the cover there from an earlier portrait. So, how did they figure within Irish society, the Wilde family, and what was the influence on James Joyce? Now, sadly, one of the most destructive effects of Oscar Wilde's imprisonment and disgrace was the almost complete obliteration is the wrong word. It's not a silencing, but the sabotaging of his mother's public reputation. What happened, he says it here in De Profundis, she and my father had bequeathed me a name they had made noble and honoured, not merely in literature, art, archaeology and science, but in the public history of my country, and in its evolution as a nation. And that's actually true. They were very important figures in the 19th century. As translators, as folklorists, as travel writers, as his interest in science, her interest in language. But as he says himself, I had disgraced that name eternally. I'd made it a low byword among low people. I had dragged it through the very mire. I'd given it to brutes that they might make it brutal, to fools that they might turn it into a synonym for folly. Now we all know the circumstance of Oscar Wilde's disgrace, don't we? That's, do you want me to go over any of that? Or is it worth it? Should I recapitulate some of it? Some of it is important. Oscar Wilde went to Oxford, became a celebrated writer, dramatist, poet, but fell from grace when he himself summoned to court Marquis of Queensberry for libel. Marquis of Queensberry was the father of his partner and in many ways nemesis, Lord Alfred Douglas. So whilst in the course of the libel trial, much evidence came to light which implicated him and Douglas, who was never tried, for what was considered gross indecency. And Wilde then went on trial and was condemned to 2 years hard labour. He was bankrupted, his wife and children had to flee Dublin, London, changed their names. And his mother, who was alive during this time, suffered greatly. She supported him completely. myths of the Oscar Wilde legend is there was a gap of 8 hours between the collapse of the second trial, the second trial, and the collapse of the libel case and his arrest. So Oscar Wilde was in a hotel in London, the Cadogan Hotel, and he waited hour after hour while the trains for Paris were leaving. And it was said 300 men left London that night to go to France, because France did not have punitive laws in relation to men and gross indecency, as the crime was called then. Oscar Wilde stayed, and he was finally arrested, found guilty, and sent to prison. And it was ruinous for his life, for his family's life. Why did he stay? And hold that thought, because it's going to be part of the kind of legend of Wilde and how it connects to James Joyce. And this is part of the research that I started to do. There's a lovely picture of James Joyce with the Davids in it. So, my book, the Oscar's Shadow, looked at what I saw as the shadow of Wilde in Ireland from 1895 up to, I think, whenever I published it. Looking at, for example, contemporary reports of the Wilde trials in 1895, and I wanted to look and see how he was accounted. And what interested, this is the question I wanted to know. When I was growing up in Ireland, we had no clue that Oscar Wilde was Irish, or that why he'd gone to prison. These things were unknown. So what interested me was, I wanted to go back to all the newspaper accounts of the Irish newspapers to see how they could account for Oscar Wilde's nationality and the nature of his crime. The British newspapers at this time, to a newspaper, condemned him, and he became, as I think was said in a novel, an unspeakable of the Oscar Wilde kind. So he became the name for condemned men who loved other men. So what did the Irish newspapers do? The Irish newspapers did something very different. They took first of all, the career of his mother, Jane Wilde Speranza. Jane Wilde had been a revolutionary poet, and she'd written a call to revolution for the journal The Nation. That newspaper was then prosecuted, the editors arrested, and a trial took place where Jane Wilde, who was a young woman at the time, she was J.R.G. Speranza, stood up in the court and tried to claim authorship of the seditious, rebellious piece. It's said, she kept saying, "It is I, it is I." But by her own account, she said, the clamour of the chivalrous men who had worked with her drowned out her prize. So she didn't go to prison, but instead the men who were working on the nation were many of them deported. So the legend of Jane Wilde Speranza was of an Irish woman revolutionary poet who had gone to a trial, faced down British justice, and had in fact been vindicated. So one of the ways that the Wilde trial was covered in Ireland was as an Irish patriot in a British court standing up to British justice. This is complete nonsense, said they politely, in the sense that Wilde, who never saw himself as a revolutionary, was, I think, very strongly influenced by his Irish heritage and Irish identity, and in fact, I think, blundered into a court case. But what happens is that people like, for example, Joyce, can then retrospectively construct him as a figure of assertion, rebellion, and dissidence. So very simply, the Irish media saw Oscar Wilde as a patriot who had been brought down by the British system. They never mentioned what his crime was, or they found their ways around it, or they had ways of dealing with it. And to some degree, what's the word? I'm not generalizing, but I am summarizing. So one of the things that happened was that the legend was that Oscar Wilde was sitting in the hotel of the Cadogan Hotel. There's a very great point by John Benjamin about it. Drinking seltzer and hock, whatever that is. I'm sure it sounds a bit decadent. It sounds like the kind of thing you drink on your way to But anyway, reading a yellow novel, or book, which of course was French and decadent, something by Baudelaire or Verlaine or whoever. And his mother arrives in, could have it, we don't know, and says, if you stay, even if you go to prison, you will always be my son. If you leave, I will never forgive you. Now, there's only one source for that, and that's W.B. Yeats. So whether this happened or not, nobody knows. It becomes a key element in the reconstruction by Oscar Wilde as a man influenced by, for example, his mother's unyielding Irish patriotism. A woman who would sacrifice her son's health. He died as a result of his time in prison. When he left, his health was ruined. His public reputation, his wife, his children, he never saw them again. They changed their names. His bankruptcy, their house in Chelsea was essentially ransacked in a bankruptcy sale. His name was taken down from every play. He lost control of his plays. Everything. It's a disaster. Oscar Wilde's prison sentence was 2 years hard labour. That meant he was on a treadmill every day. He served every minute of the sentence. And they said for a man of his class, he would die after 6 months because he had never been used to hard labour. He was educated and a gentleman and worked as he had. But this idea that he's prepared to sacrifice all for Ireland to some degree is a little vague, but is made more precise by the legend of his mother's intervention. Now, whether Speranza or Jane Wilde ever did this, we don't know. And her son's imprisonment was a disaster for her. She was very impoverished, and he supported her, took care of her. They loved each other dearly, he respected her very much. And his friends struggled after, when he was in prison, to help her. She died in great poverty while he was in prison. She visited him in prison the night of her death. He said, in a vision, like a banshee, she came to his cell, dressed for travelling, and he saw her briefly. His wife came from Switzerland, where she was in hiding, to tell him that his mother had died, knowing how much this would affect him. So, Wilde valued and respected his mother greatly. But unfortunately, one of the results of his fall was, partly in Irish sources, a kind of radical remaking of Wilde as an Irish rebel, as the son of Speranza. But also, at the same time, Speranza becomes blamed for his sexuality and his downfall because of this notion that when he was a child, she wanted a daughter and a son and dressed in skirts until the time he was 5. There's only one problem with that. All children of that period, up to a certain age, were dressed in what would be considered that kind of clothing. There's no evidence that she wanted a daughter particularly. She loved her 2 sons and then had a daughter. And Glory did her sons births in their. So, in a sense, in Irish sources, she gets valorized for creating his rebellion, at the same time denigrated because, as a mother, she's blamed for his harboring sexuality, that she was too dominant because, you know what, she was a mother who wrote poems, therefore she couldn't be a really good mother, combined with the fact that she was a highly respected scholar and translator, while taking care of her children. She did, and as she wrote in one poem, alas, the fates behold, the fates are cruel, behold Speranza making rule. In other words, she's in the nursery making her suffer for her children. So she sees, and she laughs at herself, this great poet now making rule. So the danger was to some degree that she becomes blamed, and therefore as a result there's an erosion of her scholarly reputation, of her work, and she gets a sort of secondary role as the kind of enabling Irish patriotic force, which allows him. Now Joyce, I think, is better. Joyce gives a better version of this. At one point, Shamseen talks about Wilde. He says, he talks about his De Profundis, Ballad read in jail, which he wrote in prison. This poem, written by the son of Speranza, may be devoid of Irish nationalist political intent, but is full of subversive, anti-establishment sentiment. It has about it a kind of high banshee lament, the voice of one crying in the wilderness. And this is what we get from many Irish writers after Wilde, the notion of subversive, anti-establishment sentiment. So, coming, I suppose, to the point of my lecture. Joyce. What does Joyce make of Wilde? Now, Joyce would have been, I think, around 14 or so. He was 13 when the Wilde trials took place. He didn't know about them. There's references in Megan's wake. He was very interested in them. As you know, Joyce was interested in everything. You see Casement as well becomes, so much intertextuality. He was 18 when Wilde died. But we do know, for example, that when Joyce was writing the portrait of a young man in Rome, he was reading the picture of Dorian Gray. So we know direct influences. Joyce was influenced by everything, but we know this happened. But in March 1909, Joyce published an article called Oscar Wilde, the Poet of Salome, in the newspaper in Utrecht. It was to mark the performance in Utrecht of Richard Strauss's opera Salome. And here we have, I think, a really interesting account of Joyce, by Joyce of Wilde, which in fact reconstructs Wilde in Joyce's own image. And I think allows us to reach a very strong insight into the novel that we're celebrating in Bloomsbury, Ulysses. Because it seems to me that what links Joyce and Wilde, and we'll go through it now, is this very strong sense of an Irish novelist seeking to revenge on the British novel. T.S. Eliot said that Joyce was the man who killed the 19th century. But equally argue, The Picture of Dorian Gray was a novel that seriously threatened the establishment and opened up fault lines and fissures in fantasy idea, London. The centre of London, Dorian Gray, a high society novel about the profound gap between public virtue and private vice. Only an Irishman who had gone to live in England, who got rid of his accent, and Wilde was always very clear about that. As soon as he got to England, he got rid of his Irish accent. Only an Irishman living in London, or an Irishman living in Trieste, could have such profound fascination with the English language, the English novel, the novel and the language that they had. But as Irishmen, and Irish women, understanding more precisely the very fragile negotiation of selfhood in a dominant culture, coming from a subaltern and colonized culture. It's no coincidence that the great playwrights of the English comedy of manners, writers like Sheridan, Goldsmith, Congreve, Shaw himself, Wilde himself, Shaw, many others, they write comedies of manners about the sort of comedy of how you construct yourself within society. Only an outsider can do that to what they can do. Because all of these Irish men and women, we talked about others like Lady Morgan and Edgeworth and so many others, Elizabeth Bowen, living this hyphenated identity between two cultures, they understand more profoundly than others the nature of a self-invented social identity. And therefore the picture of Dorian Gray is about the torment of that separation made visible, looking beautiful, and having a painting that's getting more and more visible sign of your inner corruption and your evil. So Wilde offers Joyce this disruptive exemplar. This is one of the things I think of. So in the essay he says, Wilde's condemnation of the English people arose from many complex causes. It was not a simple reaction of pure conscience. Anyone who follows closely the life and language of men, whether in soldiers' barracks or in the great commercial houses, would hesitate to believe that all of those who threw stones at Wilde were themselves spotless. What Dorian's great sin was, no one says and no one knows. Anyone who has recognised it has committed it. It's a brilliant insight into the novel. The picture of Dorian Gray, as we know, is a novel where the sin is never named. I saw a wonderful theatre production where the picture itself is at the centre, painted on, and Dorian, the actor, is a mirror. So in other words, the space was blank, and one would reflect. And one of the ways, the brilliance of Joyce's writing on Wilde was that he recognised that Wilde had never actually uttered or named Dorian's sin. You know, one of the things that he was interrogated about in his trial was the poem called "The Love That Dare Not Speak Its Name," a poem by Lord Alfred Douglas. But if the love that dare not speak its name doesn't speak its name, how do you know how to name it and then send someone to prison for it? And the answer is, as Joyce said, because you've committed it. So one of the things that Joyce is brilliant on is understanding how Wilde, for example, as a male writer, puts a mirror up to male patriarchal society and offers a critique that is itself an elimination of that society. One of the things that people talk about in Joyce is, for example, his representation of Irish male pub culture. Lots of them USAs take place in hotel or Davy Burns or the various pubs. And there's quite a few cruelty amongst the men towards each other, and things they say about each other. Many of the stories of Dubliners are set in pubs. Again, it's often men who go drinking, find themselves disillusioned and broke and half drunk and unhappy, and in the case of his counterpoints, goes home and beats his child. So the frustration and the dangers and the ugliness of these kind of male worlds and how they are to some degree then the consequences for the female, for the families in society. Joyce was seeing a precise analogy that Wilde was not just an Irish writer reflecting on British society, not just an Irish writer subverting the British language, British novel. He was also an Irish male writer critiquing masculine and patriarchal society. And it's the fact that Joyce in 1909 was prepared to risk an identification with Wilde, who was an unspeakable, who had gone to prison for a disturbing and unnameable and subversive sexuality. And it was the fact that Joyce was at ease with claiming the kinship of Wilde has interested me, because so many other writers, Irish writers, have done this, and while Joyce is one of the few who's prepared to identify Wilde's subversive deconstruction of the homosocial nature of his patriarchal society. My big words, sorry. Just a few other sources. Writers like Augusta Gregory, very interested in Wilde. I love the thing about the question of Footman. Did you ever kiss him? And Wilde, tired and off his guard, said, no, he was too ugly. This is true. And like, it might be great fun to make jokes like that, but that's why you end up on a treadmill for 2 years. Edward Carson, he also lied about his age to Edward Carson. He told him he was 39, he was actually 41. We can all lie about our ages, but it's never a good idea to do that to someone who's actually in school with you. Edward Carson and Oscar Wilde were in the same school and the same university. The one thing we all know is, if you meet somebody who has been in school with you, you know to the year what their age is, don't you? Because you know, well, we were all at this point. This is the source for the story of Oscar Wilde's Speranza's interversion. Yeats' idea was that Wilde's consequent reputation, his enduring reputation, partly was fueled by his downfall. And the argument has been often made that Wilde almost anticipated again and again his own disgrace, that so much of his work, like the picture of Dorian Gray, like Salome, is about self-destruction. You know, it's about a kind of Wilde in a letter very early on said that the artistic life was a long and lovely suicide. So one of the things that Yeats was interested in was, and he knew Wilde, and Yeats comes across very well from this story, because Yeats was one of the people who went to see him when he was in trouble, and he got a petition together for Irish writers to plead for Wilde's clemency. Hardly anyone signed it. Shaw was prepared to sign it, very few others. So Yeats comes out of this very well. He'd been treated well by the Wilde family, and he was treated kindly by Speranza when he first came to London. She had a little salon there. But he says, I've never doubted for an instant that he made the right decision, that he owes to that decision half of his renown. Tragedy awoke another self, the raging content that filled the crowds in the street, nor men and women with an overabundant normal sexual instinct. I heard later, I forget whom from now, that Lady Wilde had said, if you stay, even if you go to prison, you will always be my son. It will make no difference to my affection. If you go, I will never speak to you again. This becomes a staple of the Irish construction of Wilde's behaviour during his time in London. Yeats is the only source, and he said Yeats doesn't know who told him this. One theory is that he was told by Wilde's brother, Jane Wilde's other son, Wilde, who at this point was very much in the grip of the alcoholism that would kill him quite soon, and he had brought his family, his wife and his mother to great poverty as a result of his addictions and his illness. So Willie Wilde was incredibly unreliable if he was the source. Yeats doesn't even name him, so it's the question as to whether he did. So it's the ways in which Wilde and Joyce, I think, moved together, and the ways in which their work reflects this sense of using their positions and their interests as Irish writers to subvert and remake what the English novel and the English short story could do. Now, on the face of it, it seems unlikely to think Dorian Gray is a novel profoundly different to Ulysses, or Wilde's stories are very different to the stories of Douglas. You know, Ulysses is a realist novel set in a very contemporary world, the group of people from working class and lower middle class. Wilde's novel is a kind of fable of aristocracy. It's in no sense realist. I think it has an underpinning, really, of an Irish folk myth, the kind of moral tale of the double and the doubling. The stories, Wilde's stories, as we know, are like the birthday of the Infanta, the selfish giant. Many of them are, again, fables and myths remade. Joyce's short stories and Dubliners are profoundly of the 20th century, quotidian stories. What did he call them? A chapter in the moral history of the country. Story after story, realist, building up a portrait of the city. So in style, Wilde and Joyce are very different. In impulse, I think Joyce has correctly identified Wilde as perhaps his greatest influence as an Irish writer. Joyce met Yeats, who was very kind to him, and very unkindly as younger writers sometimes can be said to the older Yeats, I've met you too late, you're no good to me, you're of no use to me now. In fact, Yeats was a great use to him, gave him money and everything, very kind to him. But in fact, Wilde was the real sort of progenitor, I think, of that kind of dissidence. Now, I'm conscious of time, so can I pause? Because I'd actually love to get some kind of questions and comments. Is that okay? And open up to discussion, and then I can go back to what I want to do. As fond as I am of the sound of my own mellifluous voice, I really would love to hear, I'd love to kind of get some questions and comments. So can I pause there just for people to ask me things about the work that I've been doing, or give me your own comments? Let's put you on the spot.
I have a question.
Yeah, thank you.
Not a very serious question.
That's okay.
I was just curious about the use of Esperanza in reference to Jane Wilde. Was that like?
Thank you for that. That's an important clarification she's made. So Jane Wilde, in writing a biography which I have and also bringing out the poems, there's a huge issue about what to call her. So it's very straightforward. Well, it's not very straightforward at all. This is very useful to explain. So she was born in Dublin in 1821, the daughter of a solicitor, a lawyer, and she was born Jane Elgie. So when she began writing, Jane Francesca Elgie, when she began writing to the nation, she wrote a letter enclosing her poems, and she signed it John Ellis Fanshawe. John Fanshawe Ellis, using her own initials, as did, of course, famously, the Brontes, when they, Currier Bell, Ellis Bell, Acton Bell. So for many women writing in the 19th century, the notion of using your own name was considered a difficult one. So she wrote her letter as John Fanshawe Ellis, enclosing poems written by somebody called Speranza. So Speranza became her pen name, and of course she deliberately wanted. She said the name Elgie came from the Italian, and her ancestors were called Alighieri, which of course was the name of, which of course isn't true, but it's a great story. She said she was descended from Dante. I want to be descended from Dante. So she went with the name Speranza. So what she did was, she wrote and sent her poems to the, I'm just going to find a piece there, to the journal, so she wrote to Charles Gallagher, who was the editor of The Nation, and the poems, and he liked the poems, he wanted to publish the poems as Speranza. So he wrote to John Fanshawe Ellis and asked him to call The Nation off. He said, I was greatly struck by the first contribution and requested Mr. John Fanshawe Ellis to call to the Nation office. A smiling parlour-maid, when I departed from Mr. Ellis, showed me the drawing room. A tall girl, with stately carriage and figure, flashing brown eyes and features cast in a heroic mode, seemed fit for the genius and poetry of the spirit of revolution. So he discovers and meets this very elegant, very impressive young woman. Speranza was self-taught. She learned Italian, Spanish, French, German. She translated. She seems to have translated from Portuguese. She certainly learned Swedish in her later life. So she published the poems under the name Speranza, and she was known as Speranza of the Nation. She then married William Wilde, and he was knighted because he was head of the Irish census. So from then on in, she was known as and went by the name of Lady Jane Wilde. That's actually not the title she should have taken. She should have been Lady Wilde, but anyway, that's her business. So when she published her poems, she published them under the title of Lady Jane Wilde. So we have four options as to what to call her. I've kind of carried out this test in Ireland, and people very kindly ask me when I'm working on it, I said, I've just finished a biography of Jane Wilde. And many people will ask me, and I think that's fair enough, oh, who's she? And was she connected? How was she connected to the Wilde family? And I never say, oh, you should know this. I said, well, I explained. But I always say that Speranza, that's much more recognized, for example, in Ireland. So people would know the name. But we made the decision to stay with the name Jane Wilde, but then poems by Speranza. So it's a difficult negotiation to get her identity correct. And one of the issues is that we're seen as kind of piggybacking on Oscar's, and that's not the case at all, because he, more than anybody else, had huge respect and knowledge of her scholarship. So unfortunately, when he went to America, he went to Son of Speranza. Her last biography was called Mother of Oscar. It's to try and get all that right.
Yes. We know that Oscar Wilde said that Dorian Gray was his most moral story. And Joyce talks about the moral history in London. Are they talking about the same thing, the same concept?
That's a really good link, and it's so important that I can talk about it. As you say, Wilde said that people would that Dorian Gray is a very moral book, but people condemned it.
Yes, that's the problem.
People, one of the critics said, this is not a book for the literary critic, but a book for the police. Because they felt it was, you know, sections of Dorian Gray were listed in the trial against him. He went on trial for writing that book, partly. Wilde says, you know, or Joyce says, I want to write a chapter in the moral history of the country. Joyce's book was considered obscene, pornographic, vulgar. Somebody told me that his younger sisters, who lived for a number of years in Dublin, quietly, going about their business, and not with great, I think they were relatively poor, not rich but not poor. They didn't let people know they were James Joyce's sisters because they were afraid of people sort of taking against them and leave a bad name. So the notion that both of them are moral, but I think you're right in the link. I think they meant exactly the same thing. Joyce saw Ulysses and Dubliners as a corrective to kind of moral paralysis of his country. Wilde believed that Dorian Gray was about the dangers of aestheticism brought to a degeneracy, where art becomes more important than reality. Joyce was an aesthete, both were aesthetes. They both believed in the primacy of art. What Wilde was saying was, the world thinks I am an aesthete for its own sake. But look, I'm going to give you a tale where a man thinks that his painting is more important than he is, or his girlfriend is more important as an actress than she is a person. He loves her because she's Juliet and she's herself. He loves her because she loves him and she's the real thing. He rejects her and tells her you kill her. So I think the notion of the word moral in a good old-fashioned way is exactly correct for both. They both would have believed that the function of the artist was to teach their society. Much as George Eliot, as much as Maria Edgeworth, all the other writers that we know of that period earlier. So I think you're linking the two exactly right. And I'm going to steal that for future lectures on Joyce. But then I will correct you if I may. I think you're exactly right. I think the notion, because both were considered rebels, they were considered Irish writers who broke conventions, broke obscenity, broke the law. Actually, they had good old-fashioned notions that a book teaches its people.
I am interested in what you mentioned about the profound gap between the public virtue and the private vice in relation to the Irish novel and the English novel. What are the differences or the similarities in that gap that is provoked by them?
I think, and this is something I know that all of you will know, as we've said again and again, when people, for example, talk about Irish literature and Irish writing, and they talk about the big house novel, which we kind of were all interested in, and they talk about, say, a novel written, say, by Trump, with a house at its centre, like the Claverings, or you can talk about Castle Rackrant, or you talk about a drowned Muslim, or Bowen's work. There's a profound difference between an Irish big house and an English Jane Austen or George Eliot or whoever else home, house, estate. There's some notion of a kind of unity, political connection between the house, the estate, the village, the people are in the English novel. In the Irish novel, no such unity can ever exist. At its centre, and Bowen writes about this beautifully, the Irish big houses were set in what Bowen called the unwilling bosom whereon it was set, the Irish big house. And that's it at its most extreme. The big houses in Ireland were alien in the views of many of the writers because they were set down upon and imposed upon these landscapes. And they were beautiful, they loved the landscapes, but they were. And therefore I think it's a kind of a bigger supposition I've made about Irish writing. I've just finished this morning, this very long essay, which I was delighted to be asked to do this new history of the Irish novel. And I was given these 10 novels, which seem really different to each other. Mariah Edgeworth's Helen, right up to Max by Catherine Cecil Thurston. And I was told to write about all these 10 novels, including Picture Dorian Gray, as novels of self-invention. So really different novels, where Extra Waters is one of the novels I do. But the point what I conducted this investigation was the idea that any Irish writer dealing with really different subjects, really different settings, really different characters throughout the 19th century, what often linked all of these very different novels together was a much more fraught sense of the relation between a house and its estate, the public and the private, the creation of a self that's part of society, and the refashioning into another self. So the fragility of any public self is the kind of the argument I'm making. It's a big argument, but I think it holds up. Is more intensely under scrutiny and more intensely vulnerable than the writer is an Irish writer. Because they're writing in a society where none of the traditional links between public and private, big house and estate, between classes can be taken in any sense for granted. So the kind of fragility that we see in the relation between the big house and the surrounding landscape is also the case in novels about running set on Henry Lawless, novels set on Barren Island, Esther Waters, a novel set in England in racing fraternity, The Real Charlotte, a novel set in Big House Ireland, Dorian Gray set in London. The last two novels I deal with are The Masquerader and Max by Catherine Cecil First. Really different novels, same thing happens. Protagonists are profoundly aware that there's a gap between the public and the private that often cannot be, that actually, like Dorian Gray, will always lead to disaster when they're tested. So, suspicion, caution, unease, skepticism about these 19th century apparent certainties are more profound in the Irish writers because they are Irish and because they're usually writing and publishing in London or in New York.
I've noticed that Irish female writers are stronger than their male counterparts. And as far as Lady Wilde was concerned, she was a very important figure in London. She had a salon where most academics, painters, and artists used to go, Shaw among them, Yeats, and of course Wilde. I wonder if forcing his son to eliminate himself, was she subconsciously wanting to prove that she could be stronger than him himself in writing, in personality-wise, and she could cover Ireland and England because she was very well known in London, very well known. And she was a very strong figure. And by eliminating his son, her son, I think that psychologically there was some instinct of self-preservation, her self-preservation, while at the same time eliminating one.
Yes.
I think that it's very, that sentence of hers, if you live there, if you deny staying in prison, you're no longer my son.
Yes.
I mean, that's a very strong affirmation. And I'm not sure if she really meant it.
I think that's a really good point, the link you're making between this idea of her empowerment. And I want to pick up on that. First of all, I think she never said it. I always bring it there because I think it's such a powerful cultural image. But I believe she never said it. I just think her letters, the way she dealt with him, her kind of connection with him, her sense of pride and her sense of preservation for him, I don't believe she would have willingly allowed him to place himself in danger. I don't know where she was that day. But the fact that it was recorded as something by someone who knew her, she did say, I think this idea of strength and power that you're saying is very important, because I didn't talk about it because I didn't have time, but Jane Wilde was involved in 3 trials. The first trial was The Nation, where she tried to take responsibility for a subversive piece of work. If they had listened to her, she could have gone to prison. The second trial is the subject of my first novel, where Jane Wilde was sued for libel. Jane Wilde was sued for libel by a young woman called Mary Travers. This is a true story. And she went to prison, she went to court, and the whole case was everybody was reading about it, in Dublin, in London, everywhere. It had a spectacular ending, which I can't tell you about, because you have to go and read my novel, available on Kindle. All my novels available on Kindle at a very competitive price, and if you read it and you want to email me with questions, I'd be delighted to have them. But I can't tell you what happened in Mary Travers. But actually, when you look at the first case, The Nation, when you look at the Mary Travers trial, and then you come to Wilde's trial, Jane Wilde was successful in the first 2. She won moral victory in the first 2 cases. So the impulse for us to say, well, actually, her own experience of going into court was that she always won. In the case of Mary Travers, technically she lost, but the moral issue would make you think that maybe she thought it could happen to her son too. That she was, as you say, a powerful, strong figure. She had survived. Her husband had died, leaving her very badly off when money was gone. And she got herself to London, as you say, created a salon, became friends of, Browning, everyone. She knew everyone. They all wanted to see her. She wanted to see them. She reinvented herself in terms of her journalism, made money, survived. Left in her 50s, her comfortable, beautiful house in Dublin, which they lost, and re-established herself in Chelsea. So she was a very resourceful woman. Whether she thought that Oscar should ever go to prison, and the reality of what happened to him in prison afterwards, I think that was a terrible punishment for Pride. I can only imagine what her last year. She was living in London, and he was living there, and he had been spat upon by a crowd on his way to prison. He had been, everything had been done. So if she did urge him to stay, she was punished for it. But I think your broader point I agree with. She was used to winning, and she had that kind of power and strength and audacity. And I do think, whether she said it or not, it's kind of in character with her sense of resistance. And I think, it's a very good point. So, she was published in the 1848, around that period, 1849.
Right, okay.
So, 1847, 1848, 1849. And I had a list of some of the poems. In fact, we're reproducing them in this new edition. And so, yes, that's the period. I'm very curious to see if they were. How revolutionary was the Circus down there? Was it very revolutionary? Was it very national?
Yes, because there were this group from the community. We have the nationalist community and the pro-British community in Argentina. So you have the Standard and then the Southern Cross. And in the Southern Cross, they took all these poems in order to raise money for the revolutionaries.
And do you know if you were publishing other, like Thomas Davis, was he published, people like that?
Yes.
But then she has to be there.
She has to be there, even because she published before in 1916, but nevertheless they are recovered. They are publishing Catherine Tynan and many others. So.
And in fact, I have the names of the poems, so there's a possibility that they would be taken in the nation. Because one of the things that Eleanor Fitzsimons is working on collection, she found a number of poems published in North America by Jane Wilde, which had been part of her collected. So she wrote about Longfellow, she wrote about O'Connell. So she published a lot of newspapers and journals. I think it's unlikely they would have taken her. She was the best known of the women of the nation. There are a number of women, and some work has been done on them now. And so I think that's very much the case, definitely. So yeah. there was some things we were talking about earlier, the chapter in the moral history of my country, which I was talking about the sea. So it seems to be essential paralysis, and I've tried to present it in different public the four aspects: childhood, adolescence, and maturity, public life. Okay, that's probably as much as I wanted to say. So thanks so much for, and again, I'm here for it, so if anyone wants to ask me any questions, do please come up. But again, I hope that was of interest, and thanks so much for your attention, everyone.